So, for this portion of the chapter, I am going to make it kind of short and sweet. I am really only going to be covering a small portion of the chapter 4. So, we're going to be looking at standardized recipes. But if you look at the chapter, which I have on my screen here, you can see that there are a lot of topics in this chapter that I am going to skip over for a 100 level course. If you were going into the restaurant industry or you really were going to be formulating your own business, then you really would want to focus on the rest of this chapter pretty hard and pretty heavy. When it comes to running a successful business, I actually even encourage a lot of my students who have that frame of mind and they move forward and want to open their own establishment to really focus on the business side or even get a business degree and the culinary degree second. In my life at my age, I know a lot of people that are amazing chefs and they can cook, they can plan a menu, and it's fantastic. However, they can't run a business. And if you can't get your food costs under control, if you can't do your calculations and run your books, then your business will never be successful. But for this 100 level course, I'm really just going to focus on the parts of a standardized recipe. So when we're looking at the parts of a standardized recipe, we are looking at the difference. With my students, I talk about a restaurant recipe and a grandma recipe. So when it comes to a restaurant recipe, you're looking at the standardized recipe, you're looking at something that has been tried many, many times, adapted and retried for use. This is going to give you absolutely consistent results and yield every single time. So that means, regardless of what employee of your restaurant is making this recipe, you get the same thing. If I had a bakery and we did chocolate chip cookies, then every single time the size, the portion, the flavor, it needs to turn out the same every time. If you come to my bakery and buy a cookie on Monday and a cookie on Thursday, it should be the exact same cookies. So this is also going to be specific to the restaurant. So it's going to include some details of the specific equipment, the kitchen, and then the mise en place. Maisie, my big dog friend, my neighbor's dog, Maisie, the big mastiff. Hi, Maisie. Yes. I'm going to pause the video and let her go outside. Okay, dogs are outside. So a restaurant really needs to standardize recipes for every single menu item that they have, for consistency and for portioning. You don't want to throw away a lot of product that's really going to impact your food costs, and you need to know what the portion size is. So a standardized recipe is going to include the title of the category, the ingredients, the weight, volume of each ingredient, and in measuring, I'll talk a little bit more about weight versus volume. Preparation instructions that are extremely detailed, cooking times and temperatures, in addition to what things need to look or taste like, because time can be kind of relative. Serving size, recipe yield, and what equipment is going to be used, and the HACCP. So in the last unit, we talked about the HACCP, and that is the plan for each recipe and each step of that recipe in the flow of food to control any type of contamination. So sometimes that's going to be kind of included. So let me show you here a copy of a blank standardized recipe, and I will give you access to both this PowerPoint and the recipe format. So a blank standardized recipe format is going to differ from place to place. This is the one I use with my students. So the serving size, number of servings, the recipe title, recipe source. If you made it, it would be self. If you got it from the internet, you would just post a link here. The category, and this kind of different for each particular. If your menu has like desserts and appetizers and soups, and then where does that fit in? Cooking method. We'll talk more about cooking methods in the upcoming unit. Portion size and number of portions. That's extremely important so that you can kind of guesstimate how many of an item that you're going to sell on any given day. Many things may also have mise en place. So mise en place is going to be your setup. And for me, a lot of times in a recipe, my mise en place list is, what do I need to do before cooking starts? So does my butter need to be softened? For browned butter cookies, I would melt the butter and then cool the butter. Do things need to be set out, preheating the oven, or other types of equipment? So, when it comes to the mise en place, this is essentially for me. Sometimes there are things that need to be done beforehand, particularly done and then set to the side, like the melting of the butter and then cooling it. And this would be what that list would entail. So, what do you need to do at the onset or at the very beginning? What's your very beginning setup look like? Then you're going to have an ingredient list. So, what is the ingredient? Standard measurement versus metric conversion. I'm going to talk about measuring more specific, but a lot of times the standard measurement would be what you're used to in a grandma recipe. So, 1 cup, half of a cup. Metric conversion would look more like 16 grams, 8 ounces, and go by weight instead of volume. For preparation instructions, I kind of like to divvy it out this way. So, very specific preparation instructions. And that's another way that the grandma recipe differs from the traditional recipe. A standardized recipe should be very, very detailed in the amount of instructions that they include. HACCP, so throughout the entire flow of food of the recipe, how are you going to prevent contamination and what specific equipment is needed for that particular step? So that's kind of the parts of a standardized recipe. Your presentation here does include a little bit more information on that, kind of what I just kind of covered. So I will scroll down here. And then here's your comparison here. So when you look at this recipe, so this is your traditional, what I call a grandma recipe. It just kind of has ingredients and it has steps. It all fits on a little card. The measurements are almost always going to be in volume, how much you can fit into a vessel or a cup versus how much something weighs. Weight is always going to be more accurate. A traditional recipe generally doesn't have a yield or tell you what the portion size is. Sometimes it'll even say serve 6. Serve 6 people what? Is that 6 slices? Is that 6 cookies? Is that a dozen cookies a person? What does that mean? So a standardized recipe is going to be a lot more specific. There's also no HACCP included in that. There's also usually no mise en place or prep instructions. The standardized recipe is another example here of something you may see in standardized recipe. You can see it's a lot more detailed, a lot more detailed. And then with weight, I'll do a specific video for that one, but that's really it. So I'm going to give you access to the standardized recipe blank that you can have here, the standardized recipe presentation. You do have access as well to your textbook. The textbook chapter does give a lot of really good information, including your definitions of what a recipe versus a standardized recipe is. As it gets into the measurements and conversions, we're just going to dip into that just a little bit. But your book really does have some good information, and if you're serious about going into the restaurant industry, becoming a chef, or opening your own establishment, I really encourage you to focus on this chapter and this portion of the chapter, because the business side, that's really going to make or break you.